The world watched in terror as German tanks rolled across Europe, but few understood that beneath the thunder of guns and the roar of aircraft, another war had already begun. It was a quieter, more elusive struggle, one that unfolded not on the front lines, but in laboratories, workshops, and hidden bunkers. It was a race to master science itself, to bend the laws of nature, to serve the ambitions of nations. The victors of this shadow conflict would not just win the war, they would define the future. In 1939, as Hitler's armies invaded Poland, the world believed Germany's strength lay in its blitzkrieg, the lightning-fast tactics that overwhelmed enemies before they could react. But behind that brilliance was something far more profound, a system of research and innovation engineered to feed the war machine. Germany's scientists were among the most advanced in the world, building weapons and machines that felt decades ahead of their time. At the center of it all stood the Third Reich's obsession with supremacy, not just racial or political, but technological. Hitler envisioned a future where German science would dominate every battlefield and every frontier of human knowledge. The seeds of that dream had been planted years earlier. When the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany after World War I, the nation turned inward, wounded but determined. Out of that humiliation grew a feverish commitment to innovation. German engineers and scientists, denied open militarization, began designing in secret, developing new engines, fuels, and weapon systems under the guise of civilian research. By the time the Nazi regime rose to power, the groundwork for a scientific revolution had already been laid. At the same time, across the Atlantic, the United States stood isolated, largely content to watch Europe's turmoil from afar. Its military was modest, its scientific institutions underfunded, and its public still weary from the Great Depression. Yet, in quiet corners of American universities, some minds understood what was coming. Albert Einstein, a German refugee himself, warned that science had entered an age where energy could be harnessed in ways never before imagined. His letter to President Roosevelt in 1939, co-written with physicist Leo Szilard, sounded an alarm. Nazi Germany might be on the path to building a weapon of unimaginable power. That single letter would ignite one of the greatest scientific undertakings in history, but at that moment, it was merely a whisper. While Washington debated, Berlin was already acting. In the laboratories of the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army's weapons office, teams of scientists and engineers were pushing the limits of technology. Among them was a young visionary named Wernher von Braun, whose fascination with rocketry would soon reshape the world. Working under the supervision of the ambitious General Walter Dornberger, von Braun dreamed of reaching the stars, but his rockets would first be aimed at cities. Deep in the forests near Peenemünde, the Reich's top-secret rocket development center began constructing engines that could hurl payloads farther than any artillery in history. What started as an experiment soon became an obsession: to create a weapon that could strike Britain from across the sea faster than any defense could react. Germany's investment in rocketry wasn't just about warfare, it was about prestige. Hitler and his inner circle saw themselves as pioneers of a new era, the inheritors of a destiny to dominate both Earth and the heavens. The Führer demanded miracle weapons, and his scientists were eager to deliver. The V-2 rocket, still on the drawing boards in 1939, represented not just destruction, but power. The power to rewrite the rules of war. No airplane could intercept it, no anti-aircraft gun could touch it. It was, quite literally, the future. But science in Nazi Germany was not unified under reason. It was warped by ideology. Many of the Reich's most brilliant minds, Jewish scientists, thinkers, and mathematicians, had been exiled or killed under Hitler's racial laws. Einstein had fled to the United States. Physicists like Otto Frisch, Hans Bethe, and Niels Bohr found refuge in Britain or America. In driving away these minds, Germany had unknowingly armed its enemies. The brain drain of the 1930s became one of the Allies' greatest hidden advantages. Yet the Nazis didn't realize it. They believed that loyalty and purity could replace genius, and they pressed on with blind faith. As the war spread across Europe, another race unfolded, invisible to the public but vital to the outcome of every battle: the race for information. In the secret offices of Bletchley Park in Britain, cryptanalysts worked tirelessly to break the German Enigma code. The machine, used to encrypt military communications, was thought unbreakable. But in a quiet partnership that bridged borders, British intelligence and American mathematicians shared resources, laying the foundation of what would one day become the field of computer science. Alan Turing's work on Enigma was not just about decoding messages, it was about inventing machines that could think faster than humans. And while he worked in secrecy, German intelligence units fought to improve their ciphers, believing their codes would forever protect their empire of secrecy. In 1940, as the Luftwaffe rained bombs on London, the battle for supremacy began to shift into higher gear. Germany's technological edge was undeniable. They had introduced the first jet-powered aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262, an engineering marvel far ahead of its time. They had perfected radar-guided missiles, night vision optics, and advanced submarines with snorkel systems that allowed them to remain hidden for weeks. Even their tanks were technological masterpieces, designed with precision engineering that the Allies struggled to match. But perfection came at a price: complexity, cost, and the arrogance of overconfidence. Meanwhile, the United States, once hesitant, began awakening. The National Defense Research Committee, established in 1940, marked the beginning of America's scientific mobilization. The government poured resources into laboratories, enlisting physicists, chemists, and engineers in the war effort. This collaboration between academia, industry, and the military created a new model of innovation, one that would endure long after the war. From Bell Labs to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, new technologies were born: radar systems, proximity fuses, computing machines, and aircraft guidance instruments. The war had transformed science from curiosity to weapon. By 1941, both sides were fully engaged in this shadow war, and every new weapon, every coded message, and every laboratory breakthrough could tip the balance of history. By 1942, the world was ablaze, and beneath the smoke of battle, the true race for supremacy had entered its most feverish phase. The Third Reich stood at the height of its power. Its armies stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Stalingrad. Yet while soldiers fought and died across continents, in the quiet corners of Germany, another army, one of scientists and engineers, was waging its own desperate campaign to keep the Reich's technological lead alive. The center of this hidden empire was Peenemünde, a small island on the Baltic coast transformed into a city of secrets. Behind high fences and under tight security, thousands of engineers worked day and night to turn theory into terror. Werner von Braun's dream of spaceflight had been harnessed by the military into something darker: the V-2 rocket. Standing 14 meters tall, fueled by a volatile mix of alcohol and oxygen, it was the first human-made object capable of reaching the edge of space.
When it struck, it did so faster than the speed of sound. There was no warning, no defense, no escape. The V-2 was more than a weapon. It was a promise. Hitler saw it as the miracle that would turn the tide of war. To his generals, it was a symbol of German genius, proof that their science still outshone the Allies. But in truth, it was also a monument to desperation. The cost of each rocket was astronomical, the materials scarce, and the production scattered across hidden facilities deep underground. The Reich was burning through its remaining resources, chasing a technological dream it could barely sustain. Across the ocean, American intelligence was just beginning to understand what was happening. Through intercepted communications and whispers from the resistance, Allied analysts pieced together fragments of a terrifying puzzle. Reports of long-range rockets, of strange engines being tested on the Baltic coast. At first, many dismissed it as exaggeration. The idea of a missile traveling hundreds of kilometers seemed impossible. But a few, including British intelligence officer R.V. Jones, took the threat seriously. Jones pushed for reconnaissance flights and resistance reports from occupied Europe, and slowly evidence emerged. Photographs of strange launch pads, fuel depots, and assembly halls. The Allies realized that the Germans were trying to build something unprecedented. While Germany dreamed of vengeance from the skies, the United States was building the foundations of modern science. America's laboratories had become fortresses of invention. The National Defense Research Committee and its successor, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, united universities and industries under one command. Out of these efforts came innovations that would reshape the battlefield. Radar was perhaps the most transformative. The technology first developed by the British before the war was perfected by American engineers. It could detect aircraft and ships far beyond the horizon, turning surprise attacks into failed gambits. The secret lay in magnetrons, tiny devices that generated powerful microwaves. Factories across the U.S. produced them by the thousands, and radar became the invisible shield of the Allies. It guided anti-aircraft guns, directed night fighters, and allowed fleets to see through fog and darkness. In a war where vision often meant survival, radar became the eye that never blinked. Germany, too, had its radar systems, sophisticated, even superior in some respects. But Allied bombing campaigns targeted their installations relentlessly. Every German advancement was met with a countermeasure, every secret weapon shadowed by Allied intelligence. It became a duel of innovation, a dance of invention and destruction. In 1943, another more secret project began to take form in the American Southwest. Codenamed the Manhattan Project, it gathered some of the brightest minds of the century under one purpose: to unlock the energy of the atom before Germany could. Scientists who had fled Europe, men who once studied in German universities, now worked to defeat the nation that had cast them out. Under the leadership of General Leslie Groves and physicist R.J. Robert Oppenheimer, laboratories were established at Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. Each facility focused on a piece of the puzzle: uranium enrichment, plutonium production, and bomb design. It was a race against time. Rumors spread that Germany had its own nuclear program, led by physicist Werner Heisenberg, one of the most brilliant minds in Europe. Allied intelligence feared the consequences of a Nazi atomic bomb, an end to the war not with surrender, but with annihilation. And so espionage became a vital weapon. Operation Alsos, a secret Allied mission, was created to track down and capture Germany's nuclear research. Spies, scientists, and soldiers worked together to follow the trail of uranium shipments and reactor experiments hidden across occupied Europe. Back in Germany, Heisenberg and his team struggled with limited resources and growing pressure. The Nazi regime demanded results but failed to grasp the complexity of nuclear fission. Political interference, lack of cooperation, and sheer chaos crippled the project. German scientists argued over theory, unable to secure the industrial backing necessary to build a functioning reactor. While America poured billions into its atomic effort, Germany's nuclear ambitions languished in confusion. By 1943, cracks were beginning to show in the once invincible Reich. The defeats at Stalingrad in North Africa had shaken Hitler's confidence. As his empire contracted, he placed even greater faith in his scientists to deliver salvation. Wunderwaffen, he called them, wonder weapons that would strike fear into Allied hearts and restore German dominance. The V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 rocket, jet fighters, and new submarines were all hailed as the keys to victory. In truth, they were symptoms of desperation. At Peenemünde, von Braun's rockets began to fly successfully. Test launches blazed across the night sky, stunning observers with their speed and power. The first V-2s reached heights no human had ever achieved, touching the edge of space before plunging back to Earth. Yet as these triumphs occurred, Allied reconnaissance was closing in. In the summer of 1943, the British launched Operation Hydra, a massive bombing raid on Peenemünde. Hundreds of aircraft descended on the island, devastating the facilities and killing many of von Braun's team. The heart of Germany's rocket program was shattered, forcing production to move underground into the brutal tunnels of the Mittelwerk complex. There, in the cold darkness of the Harz Mountains, thousands of concentration camp prisoners were forced to assemble V-2 rockets by hand. The miracle weapon had become a machine of suffering. For every rocket that soared into the sky, hundreds of lives were extinguished in the tunnels below. The war for science had lost its soul. While Germany buried its dreams underground, the Americans looked upward. At Los Alamos, the atomic project moved forward with astonishing speed. New machines enriched uranium, new reactors bred plutonium, and theoretical designs became blueprints for something the world had never seen. Each day brought them closer to an answer that could end the war or end humanity. But science alone would not win the race. Espionage, deception, and courage played their parts as well. In Europe, Allied spies risked everything to uncover German secrets. The Norwegian resistance carried out one of the most daring sabotage missions of the war at the Värmok heavy water plant, striking a blow that crippled Germany's chances of producing the materials needed for a nuclear bomb. Meanwhile, in Britain, codebreakers at Bletchley Park continued to crack German communications, revealing the positions of submarines, troop movements, and even scientific correspondence. It was here that the worlds of mathematics and espionage fused into something entirely new. The need to process massive amounts of encrypted data led engineers to develop early computing systems, primitive by modern standards, yet revolutionary in concept. These machines, like the British Colossus, could analyze thousands of codes faster than any human. The digital age had been born in the midst of war, nurtured by necessity and secrecy. By the end of 1943, the secret war had reached its turning point. The Allies were gaining ground, not only on the battlefields, but in the laboratories and workshops where the future was being written. Germany's innovations, once unmatched, were now being met and surpassed.
By 1944, the war had entered its most desperate stage. Germany still fought ferociously on every front, but beneath the surface, its once mighty engine of science was beginning to falter.
The grand vision of technological dominance was cracking under the weight of defeat, sabotage, and exhaustion. Yet, in that chaos, the Third Reich became more dangerous than ever. Hitler had begun to place his faith not in generals, but in scientists, men who promised salvation through invention. The result was a feverish rush to create the so-called Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons that would supposedly turn the tide. But the miracle Germany prayed for would never come. What emerged instead were shadows of power, terrifying machines years ahead of their time, unleashed too late and under the worst possible circumstances. The first of these was the V-1 flying bomb. It was simple, brutal, and relentless, a pilotless jet-powered missile that buzzed through the sky with a haunting mechanical growl. The British called it the buzz bomb, and the sound became a symbol of dread. When the drone of the engine stopped, silence hung for a few seconds. Then came the explosion. Each V-1 carried nearly a ton of explosives and could reach speeds of over 400 miles per hour. London, already scarred from years of bombing, once again faced nightly terror from the skies. These attacks were more psychological than strategic, but they revealed the lengths to which Germany was willing to go. The V-1 represented the birth of the modern cruise missile, crude, imprecise, but revolutionary. In underground factories and secret launch sites across northern France, thousands were built by forced laborers. It was mass production through misery, an industrial nightmare hidden beneath the earth. Yet even the V-1 was only a prelude to something far more devastating, the V-2 rocket. When the first V-2s struck London in September 1944, they arrived without warning, supersonic, invisible until impact. Houses vanished in flashes of fire and dust. People spoke of them as the weapon that fell from space. Each launch was a triumph of engineering and a tragedy of war. Werner von Braun's creation had finally proven itself, but its success came at a terrible cost. The tunnels of Mittelwerk, where prisoners labored in inhuman conditions to assemble the rockets, had become mass graves. Von Braun himself, though brilliant, was trapped in moral contradiction. He dreamed of space exploration, of rockets reaching the stars, yet his genius was changed to a regime of terror. In private, he admitted that his work was being used for destruction, but to resist meant death. His ambitions for science were caught in the machinery of dictatorship, a haunting reminder that knowledge, in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon without conscience. As the V-weapons fell on Britain, the Allies responded not only with force, but with ingenuity. British intelligence, aided by resistance groups in France and Belgium, hunted for launch sites, mapping the vast network of ramps and bunkers hidden in forests and farmlands. RAF bombers targeted them relentlessly, sometimes guided by radar, sometimes by sheer determination. Each destroyed site saved countless lives, but new ones seemed to appear just as quickly. The campaign against the V-weapons became a battle between two forms of innovation, one driven by fear, the other by necessity. Meanwhile, in the skies over Europe, another technological revolution was taking shape. The Messerschmitt MS-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, roared into battle. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it was unlike anything the Allies had ever seen. Propelled by twin turbojet engines, the MS-262 could outrun any Allied aircraft. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was nearly untouchable. But like so many of Germany's inventions, it arrived too late. Fuel shortages, manufacturing delays, and Hitler's obsession with using the jet as a bomber crippled its effectiveness. The few MS-262 squadrons that made it into combat achieved impressive kills, but were too few to change the outcome. Allied bombing of fuel refineries and airfields further grounded the jets, leaving many destroyed before they even took off. Still, the MS-262 left a mark that would echo into the future. Its design became the blueprint for post-war aviation, inspiring aircraft on both sides of the emerging Cold War. While Germany pursued miracles, the Allies focused on practicality. American factories churned out thousands of bombers, tanks, and ships each month. But behind that industrial power was an equally fierce scientific effort. The U.S. perfected the proximity fuse, a device that allowed artillery shells to explode when near a target rather than on impact. It transformed anti-aircraft defense and helped turn the skies into a deadly trap for enemy planes. The radar-guided bombing systems refined at MIT's radiation laboratory allowed nighttime and all-weather operations, while sonar made the Atlantic safer for Allied convoys by detecting German U-boats lurking below. Each of these technologies represented countless hours of research, testing, and risk, and each helped ensure that Germany's once superior weaponry could no longer guarantee victory. By mid-1944, the momentum had shifted completely. The Allies had landed in Normandy, establishing a foothold on the European continent. The war's end was not yet in sight, but its direction was unmistakable. And still, Hitler refused to accept it. He clung to dreams of new weapons that would reverse his fate. Deep in Bavaria, engineers worked feverishly on advanced jet bombers, guided missiles, and even rumored super tanks. SS researchers explored unconventional weapons, from chemical agents to sonic devices, many of them fantasies born from desperation. Germany had become a nation obsessed with innovation as salvation, but the truth was simpler. No weapon, no matter how advanced, could compensate for a collapsing empire. Behind the front lines, the human cost of this obsession grew unbearable. Scientists lived under constant threat. Failure was treason, and treason meant death. The Gestapo monitored laboratories, fearing sabotage and disloyalty. Some scientists, realizing the inevitable defeat, began quietly preparing for the end, hiding their research, destroying documents, or seeking contact with the Allies. Among them were men like Heisenberg, who saw his nuclear program collapsing under impossible conditions, and von Braun, who began to dream not of victory, but of survival. In secret, his team started storing their research where it might be found by the Americans rather than the Soviets. They understood that whoever captured their work would hold the keys to the next age of warfare. As Germany's technological empire crumbled, the United States' own scientific colossus continued to grow. In the deserts of New Mexico, under Oppenheimer's guidance, the atomic bomb project neared completion. The laboratories buzzed with activity, physicists and engineers working around the clock, each unaware of the full picture, each contributing a piece to a weapon that would eclipse everything Germany had built. But in early 1944, none of this was yet known to the world. What was known was that the Allies had turned Germany's scientific brilliance against itself. Every intercepted message, every captured blueprint, every decoded signal tightened the noose. At Bletchley Park, the relentless codebreakers continued to penetrate the Enigma and Lorenz ciphers. Their work revealed German logistics, troop movements, and even internal communications from the Rocket Command. The intelligence saved thousands of lives and accelerated Germany's downfall, but no one outside the highest levels of command would know of their contribution for decades. By late 1944, as Allied forces pushed closer to Germany's borders, the dream of technological supremacy that had once fueled the Reich now haunted it. Laboratories were bombed, projects abandoned, scientists fleeing or conscripted into hopeless efforts. The once mighty vision of a technologically invincible empire was collapsing into ruins. Yet, in those ruins, history was being rewritten. The same research that had begun as tools of war would soon become the foundation for humanity's greatest achievements: jet travel, rocketry, computing, and atomic energy. But before that transformation could begin, the war had to end, and the final months of 1945 would see science itself become both savior and destroyer.
Winter of 1945. Europe was a wasteland. Entire cities lay in ruins. Empires had collapsed, and millions wandered in search of safety. Yet even as Germany's defeat loomed inevitable, the war for supremacy had not ended. In laboratories and bunkers scattered across the dying Reich, scientists still labored in the shadows, clinging to the faint hope that one last miracle could turn back the tide. Berlin was a city of ghosts. The once proud capital of the Reich had become a fortress of rubble and despair. But beneath its shattered streets, research continued, desperate, frantic, and often delusional. Rumors circulated through the ranks of soldiers and civilians alike that Hitler had secret weapons hidden deep underground, that a single invention could wipe out the enemy armies gathering on Germany's borders. The propaganda spoke of Wunderwaffe that would make the Allies tremble. The truth was far less grand. Most of those projects were scattered fragments, prototypes,
half-finished designs, or simple fantasies born from a regime unwilling to face reality. Yet some of those fragments were terrifyingly real. In late 1944, the V2 campaign intensified. Hundreds of rockets were launched toward London, Antwerp, and Paris. Civilians were killed by the thousands. Each rocket that struck was a cruel message that even in defeat, the Reich could still reach across the sky. But the bombardments, though horrifying, achieved nothing. The resources spent on each V2 could have built dozens of conventional weapons, aircraft, or tanks. The rockets that roared into the heavens carried not victory, but Germany's final breath of scientific glory. At Peenemünde, the heart of Germany's rocket program, activity had ceased. Allied bombers had reduced it to ashes, and the remaining engineers had fled south to the Alps. Among them was Wernher von Braun, exhausted, disillusioned, and increasingly aware that his future no longer lay with the Reich. In secret meetings with his closest colleagues, von Braun made a fateful decision. He would surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets. The Red Army was approaching from the east, and von Braun knew what awaited German scientists in their hands. He and his team gathered their notes, designs, and blueprints, everything that could prove their worth, and began their journey toward Bavaria, where the Americans were advancing. At the same time, in other corners of Germany, scientists made their own desperate calculations. Some tried to destroy evidence of their work, fearing retribution. Others sought to escape under false identities. The empire of science that had once served the Nazi dream was now crumbling, and its masters were choosing survival over loyalty. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States stood on the brink of unveiling a weapon that would forever change the world. The Manhattan Project, which had begun in secrecy in 1942, had achieved the impossible. In the deserts of New Mexico, under the bright, merciless sun, a team of physicists, chemists, and engineers had unlocked the atom. They had harnessed the very building blocks of the universe to create a weapon of unimaginable power. On July 16, 1945, before dawn, the desert was silent. Then, in an instant, the night turned to day. A blinding light erupted over the sands of Alamogordo, brighter than 1,000 suns. The shock wave rippled across the desert, and a mushroom cloud rose into the stratosphere. The first atomic bomb had been detonated. The test was codenamed Trinity, and in that moment, humanity crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. When J. Robert Oppenheimer watched the explosion, he recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He knew, as did everyone present, that the war was no longer a matter of who could win, but who could end it first. In the following weeks, the atomic bombs would be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing a sudden and terrible end to the conflict in the Pacific. But their roots lay in the shadow war between Germany and the United States. The bomb was born from the fear that Nazi Germany might build it first, from a race that had begun years earlier when Einstein's warning reached Roosevelt's desk. The irony was cruel. The weapon that ended the war was built to stop a threat that never materialized. While the world's attention turned to Japan, the aftermath in Europe was unfolding quietly. As Allied armies occupied the remnants of the Reich, a new mission began, one that would determine the balance of power for the next century. It was called Operation Paperclip. Under its cover, American intelligence units scoured Germany for scientists, engineers, and documents related to advanced weaponry. They were racing not just against time, but against their own allies, the Soviet Union, which was also capturing German expertise at a furious pace. Laboratories, factories, and archives were stripped bare. Everything from jet engines to rocketry to chemical research was packed up and shipped west. Von Braun and his team surrendered to American forces in May 1945. They were quickly transported out of Germany along with more than 100 of their colleagues. Their knowledge, once used to terrorize Europe, would now help the United States reach the stars. the same man who had built the V2 would one day build the Saturn V, the rocket that carried mankind to the moon. History had turned full circle, from weapons of war to instruments of exploration. But in 1945, no one could yet see that future. The world was exhausted, broken, and uncertain. The age of science, which had promised enlightenment, had delivered both wonder and horror. The very inventions that had accelerated progress had also made destruction effortless. In 6 short years, humanity had leaped from propeller planes to jet fighters, from radio waves to radar, from chemical explosions to nuclear fire. In Germany's fall and America's rise, the lesson was clear. Wars were no longer decided solely by armies, but by the minds that armed them. The scientists, once mere observers, had become the new generals. Equations were now as deadly as bullets, and laboratories were as vital as battlefields. As the smoke of war cleared, the surviving scientists of both nations faced their own reckoning. Some found redemption in rebuilding a broken world, creating medicines, advancing energy research, or laying the foundations of space exploration. Others lived with guilt, haunted by the knowledge of what their discoveries had done. The war had proven that science could no longer be separated from morality. Every invention carried a shadow. The race for supremacy that had begun in secrecy before the first shot of World War II did not truly end in 1945. It only changed form. The new battleground would be ideological, stretching from Berlin to Washington to Moscow. But the foundation of that struggle had been built in those frantic years between 1939 and 1945, when nations fought not just for land, but for knowledge, for the power to shape the future. As the guns finally fell silent, the world stood at a crossroads. The United States emerged as a technological titan, propelled by the momentum of wartime science. Nazi Germany, which had once seemed invincible in its innovation, lay in ruins. Yet even in defeat, its legacy of discovery would shape generations to come. In rockets, in medicine, in physics, in the very tools that defined the modern age. It was a cruel paradox. The same human brilliance that had nearly destroyed civilization also paved the way for its greatest achievements. The war had proven that science could no longer be separated from humanity. Every invention carried a shadow. In the end, the greatest weapon of all was not the bomb, the rocket, or the code. It was knowledge itself.